Hi, you may be here today to watch this video as part of your concealed carry permit class. I'm Amy Barnhorst. I'm a psychiatrist from UC Davis, and I'm here to talk to you about a really important topic, the intersection of firearms and mental health, what firearm owners should know. So why is this an important topic, to learn about the intersection of mental health and firearms? Owning a firearm comes with responsibilities, but it also comes with certain risks. Firearm owners are stewards of safety, and many of you may own guns to protect yourselves and your family. But it's really important to remember that that doesn't just mean keeping them safe from an accident or attack. There are actually situations where having a gun in the mix can make the situation very deadly. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is how mental health crises in combination with firearms can be lethal. A few disclaimers and warnings. This presentation is going to deal with sensitive topics like mental health and suicide prevention. And if you're someone who struggles with mental health issues or suicidality, there's assistance available 24/7 at the new 988 crisis and suicide line. It's kind of like 911 for mental health crises or suicidal crises. And we'll also share additional mental health resources at the end of this presentation. So let's start with some simple definitions. What is mental health and what is mental illness? Mental health, like many things, exists on a spectrum. So at the top of this graph, you can see in the green, there's mental health. At the very bottom is mental illness. Somewhere in between is mental health problems or mental health struggles. And mental health might look like you're doing great, you're feeling good, you're happy most days, getting good sleep, exercising, connecting in positive ways with family and friends, finding meaning in your life. Mental health struggles may look like, things feel stressful. Some days you don't really feel motivated to do the things you need to do. You might have bouts of depression, you might not be sleeping as well, or exercising or eating as well. And if that gets worse, it may become a mental illness where you may really struggle doing the things that you need to do to take care of yourself or take care of your family and meeting social obligations, and you may need professional help to manage your mental illness. For most people, their mental health fluctuates. They may go back and forth between mental health problems, and even mental illness. And these things change over time depending on what's going on in our lives. Internal and external stressors can change our mental health. So things that have a big effect on us, relationship loss, this can be a breakup or a death, job loss, medical conditions, legal problems, financial problems. All of these things can cause us to feel more stress, and these can cause a variety of symptoms, such as insomnia and fatigue, difficulty concentrating, having problems with your self-worth or your self-esteem, having worse diet and lower physical activity, feeling socially isolated or disconnected from people, having increased levels of irritability, anxiety, or sadness, and maybe increasing drug and alcohol use. All of these symptoms can be part of mental health problems. They can also lead to worsening mental health themselves, and they may exacerbate or cause a mental illness. So people may have illnesses like major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, PTSD, or schizophrenia. Mental illness is common in the United States. It's something we don't talk about very much, but 20% of adults in any year experience a mental illness. That's 1 in 5 people. And 5% of adults experience what's known as a serious mental illness. So a mental illness might be something like periodic depression, an anxiety disorder, OCD. A serious mental illness is something more like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, where you may need to be managed by a professional. It may get so bad that you're not able to go to work or go to school. You may need to be periodically hospitalized to deal with your condition. Unfortunately, about half of the people, a little bit less than half, who have any kind of mental illness, not even just a serious one, receive mental health services in the US. And you can see here on the left, only about 47% of people receive services. On the right, there's a gender split. So men are much less likely to receive services, probably because they're less likely to seek them than women. This means a lot of people who are struggling with mental health problems are trying to deal with them on their own. So why firearms? Why mental health and firearms? What's the importance of that relationship? Oftentimes this relationship comes up in the context of mass shootings. And people make this connection between mental illness and guns But mass shootings are very rare. They're not the main contributor to firearm deaths in our country, and they're not generally caused by mental illness. Mass shootings tend to have a lot of contributing factors. Oftentimes people have been radicalized by hate groups, or they have misogynistic or racist ideologies, or they hold a grievance or a grudge against their school or their workplace. Firearms are one of the top leading causes of death in the US, although, again, generally not from mass shootings. In 2022, there were almost 50,000 deaths from firearms, and that means about 132 people a day died on average from guns. It was one of the top causes of death among adults under 45, and in the last few years, it was the top cause of death among children and teenagers. It used to be, you can see from this graph, the motor vehicles are in the gray and firearm deaths are in the pink. It used to be that motor vehicle crashes killed many more people than firearms. But over time, with changes in vehicle safety and road safety, in 2017, we saw these two graphs cross, and now firearm deaths outnumber motor vehicle crash deaths every year. The reason that mental health is important to talk about in this discussion about firearm deaths is that most of the firearm deaths in the United States are actually suicides. And this is data from 2018 to 2022. Consistently during that time, around 54% of the firearm deaths were suicides. 43% were homicides, and less than 1% of them, even though they got a lot more media coverage, were from mass shootings. This is largely because people don't talk about suicide as much, and oftentimes it's very stigmatized. It's not reported in the media when somebody dies by suicide, and when somebody does die by suicide, it's not reported on the method. So oftentimes folks are not aware how many of our firearm deaths in the US are actually suicides. Firearms are the most common method of suicide in the US, and you can see from the data from this one study that firearms comprise more than half of suicides at 52%. They're also the most common method of homicide. 78% of homicides in the study period were by firearm. This is because when someone's in a crisis, a suicidal crisis or a homicidal crisis, and there's a firearm in the mix, they increase the lethality of the situation and they make it much more likely that somebody will die. So for responsible firearm owners, how can you tell if somebody's at risk or in crisis and maybe shouldn't have access to their firearms for that period? There are a number of risk factors for suicide. Some of them are medical or psychiatric risk factors. So psychiatric disorders like depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia all can increase somebody's risk of suicide. As can dementia. So people in the beginning of cognitive decline, they still have the wherewithal to understand what they're losing, and they may be very depressed and upset about their future. So there's an increased risk in the early stages of dementia. Substance misuse like alcohol also increases the suicide risk, particularly in people who are heavy drinkers. Alcohol is a depressant, and it also really clouds people's judgment. Illnesses like chronic pain or a terminal cancer diagnosis or other serious medical illnesses can also bring a risk of suicide, as people have this sort of suffering that's ongoing and they don't see a light at the end of the tunnel or a way out. There are also situational risk factors, so stuff that's happening outside the person. Poverty and financial problems, recent relationship or job loss, isolation or feelings of hopelessness, and legal problems, people who are facing incarceration or long sentences. These kinds of situational factors can also elevate a risk of someone's suicide. Risk factors for violence are a bit different, but there's actually a lot of overlap. People who experience intense anger or rage, impulsive behaviors, which also is a risk factor for suicide. Folks who have a mental illness where they might experience hallucinations or paranoia, so they're being told they need to do something, or they're afraid that somebody's going to hurt them or their family, even if it's not the case, they may lash out and do something. Folks who have a long history of sort of these injustices that they feel against them, or grudge holding or grievances, and they may, want to take revenge on those parties. Anyone who is involved in abusive relationships or ongoing domestic disputes. And then again, we see increased drug and alcohol use as a risk factor for violence, because again, it's disinhibiting and it makes people impulsive. There are other signs of crisis as well, so other things to look out for in your friends and family. If people are feeling hopelessness, if they're starting to say things about how they're a burden to you, that they don't have future-oriented thoughts. You're asking them about next week, next month, and you're realizing it's not really on their mental calendar. If they express thoughts about not really wanting to be around anymore, and they start withdrawing from friends and family, or they have any drastic changes in their mood and personality, these are other signs of crises that should make you wonder if this person is doing okay. Also, if anyone has actually explicitly stated, I'm thinking about hurting myself, or I want to go kill my boss, or they are having thoughts about these things that they can't really stop thinking about. Another big risk factor for lethal violence or suicide is having access to a firearm. Because again, guns can be very lethal in crisis situations. So much so that just owning a handgun increases the risk that somebody will die by suicide by a factor of almost 4, as compared to people who don't own handguns. And this isn't just suicide by handgun, this is all suicide. Likewise, having a handgun in the home increases the risk that somebody in that household will die by homicide by more than 2 times. And when an abusive partner has access to a gun, the risk that that victim will die goes up by a factor of 5. So once again, guns in these crisis situations can really escalate the lethality. We see this for teenagers who are struggling and in crisis as well. So 2/3 of school shootings in one study were carried out by children under the age of 18 who aren't old enough to buy their own firearms. But the thing that put these kids over the edge into being school shooters was that they were able to access weapons from their home or the home of relatives or friends. In fact, 80% of these cases, the guns came from somewhere they had access to them. So again, having access to a firearm during a time of crisis increases the risk that somebody will die by suicide or homicide. So what can responsible firearm owners do about people in crisis? Putting some time and space between a person who's in crisis and their firearm can keep a bad situation from getting worse. And there's this idea that if somebody is suicidal and they're thinking about ending their life, that they'll find a way to do it. And if you take away one method, they'll find another method. But the truth of the matter is that most people in a suicidal crisis, they don't actually just go find another way. Some of them may, but any other method they grab is less likely to be lethal than a firearm. And the other thing is that many suicidal crises are time limited. So if you put some time and space between that person and their gun, their crisis may very well resolve in the meantime. And we've seen this with putting waiting periods in place for people to access guns and purchase them, that it actually reduces suicides because it takes such a long time for the person to get access to a lethal weapon that their crisis resolves. If you take away the deadliest method available to somebody, the odds of their survival go way up. Most suicide attempts are actually surprisingly impulsive. And this was an interesting study that looked at people who landed in a hospital or an ER needing life-saving medical treatment after a suicide attempt. And it asked the patients, how long did you think about this before you actually made your attempt? So what was the time between your first thought of suicide and the suicide attempt? So you can see here on the far right of this graph that there were a number of people who planned this out for quite some time that would have been able to get a hold of another firearm or would have, stockpiled medications. They put some time and planning into their suicide attempt. But now look over on the left side of the graph, and you can see that almost half of the people that they surveyed thought about this literally life-ending decision for less than 10 minutes. So these people grabbed what they had access to, and if what they had access to was a bottle of over-the-counter medication, their outcome was likely to be very different than if what they had access to was a firearm. So again, the importance of that time and space. People don't often reach for firearms in their suicide attempts. This is a pie chart that shows the various types of suicide methods used in attempts in the United States. And you can see that firearms only comprise about 5% of the attempts. But now let's look at the deaths. Firearms now in the pink have gone up to being more than half of the suicide deaths. This is because almost everybody who attempts with a firearm dies. Whereas you can compare that to the people who attempt with drug poisoning or overdose in the blue part of the pie. Only about 10% of those are fatal. So again, the thing that you reach for in that time of crisis, if it's something very lethal, you're unlikely to get a second chance. And most people who survive a serious suicide attempt don't go on to die by another one. They come out of that bad period of their life and they do fine. We've also seen that policies to remove firearms from people in crisis prevent violence, not just suicide. And civil protective orders, also known as restraining orders, are one example of this. In California, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, we have a number of civil protective orders that temporarily restrict the person subject to the order, restrict their access to firearms. And we've seen through research that this reduces the risk of intimate partner homicide and domestic violence. And also that some of the gun violence restraining orders have been used to prevent at least 58 mass shootings in California, because you're getting the lethal means out of the equation when there's a crisis going on. You can help keep your friends and family safe, and you probably know people who have had various types of mental health crises. Maybe a teenager who's felt suicidal or has been self-harming, or a housemate who's gotten out of an abusive relationship but is still really worried about violence. Maybe you have an older family member who's showing signs of dementia, or a friend who got fired and said he wants to kill his boss. Maybe a spouse who's been depressed and drinking more heavily. These are all folks that should fall on your radar as part of your community that may be at risk. And people for whom putting some time and space between them and a firearm might keep them from a much worse situation than they're already in. Okay, so how do you do that? How do you put some time and space in between a person in crisis and their firearm? One option is to store firearms so that they're not accessible to the person in crisis. Ideally, you would store those firearms unloaded, locked up using a locking device, separate from their ammunition, and this part's really important, with the keys and combinations inaccessible to the person at risk. So for example, if you live with your spouse and you're concerned they may be depressed and suicidal, and the combo to your gun safe is your wedding anniversary, you have to change the combo so they can't get in there. So making sure that they don't have the keys aren't kept in your junk drawer, they don't know the combo lock. Sometimes that's not sufficient, and you want to get the firearms all the way out of the house or get them, more space in between the person at risk. In California, firearms can be temporarily transferred without a background check or a firearm safety certificate to a person in case of a suicidal crisis. And this is one of the few exceptions we have to our fairly stringent background check requirements. A couple criteria have to be met. So the recipient has to be 18 years of age and can't use the firearm for any purpose. So they can't just, take it out to the range or hunting. The firearm has to be kept unloaded and locked up in their home, and the transfer has to be time limited. So theoretically, the person should get it back after the crisis has resolved. This can be a really effective method for just getting the guns out of the home and out of sight and out of mind while the person recovers from whatever it is going on. And there are oftentimes gun shops and ranges and even some law enforcement agencies who will also store people's firearms, sometimes no questions asked, at various costs in times of a suicidal crisis when somebody wants to get them out of the home. Occasionally, you're worried enough about somebody that an emergency action may be necessary in a higher risk situation. When that person is so in the throes of their crisis, they're not willing or not able to cooperate, but you feel very strongly that they need a little bit of that time and space between them and their firearms. So protective orders are one way that you can mandate relinquishment temporarily of somebody's firearms. And a mental health hold, also known in California as a 5150, if the person needs mental health treatment, can be another way to get that time and space in there in a crisis situation. In California, we have various protective orders for different situations and different relationships between the petitioner and the respondent. So domestic violence restraining orders are maybe one of the best known if somebody is in an abusive relationship or there's domestic violence within the household. School violence restraining orders can be used in situations where somebody is making threats to, shoot up their school or hurt somebody within the school system. Workplace violence restraining orders, kind of the same principle, but they apply to people's workplaces. There are elder and dependent abuse restraining orders that can be used for vulnerable populations where they're being taken advantage of or abused by a caregiver. Civil harassment restraining orders can be put in place when none of these other relationship criteria are met. And then gun violence restraining orders, which aren't about the specific location or the relationship between the people. They're more about the person is making threats either to harm themselves or someone else with a firearm specifically. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about those because they're very much targeted at mental health crisis and firearm access. Gun violence restraining orders are temporary civil orders. And the idea is that it's a court order to have a person's guns temporarily removed based on them being a significant danger in the near future to themselves or another person or people with a firearm. There doesn't have to be any criminal activity. They don't have to need a mental health hold or even have any sort of mental health history going on. There just needs to be enough evidence to show a judge that this person is making threats, posting things on social media, acting in a way that's very concerning, that they're a significant danger in the near future because of a firearm. In California, various people can get a GVRO. So potential petitioners would include family and household members, law enforcement, school officials and teachers, employers and co-workers, and also dating partners and co-parents. Despite the wide number of petitioners we have, most of our orders are actually filed by law enforcement. So the way GVROs work, represented by the siren, is somebody who's in some kind of crisis comes to the attention of either their employer, someone at their school, a family member. And that person or law enforcement officer can petition for either an emergency or an ex parte order. And the idea is to get the guns out of the crisis situation very quickly by mandating relinquishment and making sure that this person can't buy more guns in the short term. Due process is preserved, so within 3 weeks, that person gets a hearing before the judge. And at the hearing, they get to argue their case and say, hey, I was just joking, I was never gonna do those things, or I was feeling really down, but I'm back on my medication and I'm not depressed anymore, I'm no longer at risk of suicide. And the judge at that point can decide whether or not to continue the order for 6 months or up to a few years, or to drop the order and return that person's firearms and reinstate their rights. About half of these orders are dropped at the time of the hearing. So only about 50% of them go on to have a longer order. But once the order ends, the person's firearm rights are returned to them, they can get their firearms back and purchase more, and there's nothing on their criminal record, it's a civil order. Mental health holds can be another option, again, for putting time and space between a person in crisis and their firearm. But they're really only helpful if the danger is because of a mental illness. So if somebody says, I want to kill my boss because he fired me and that wasn't fair and he's always been a jerk, that's not a good idea, but it's not necessarily a mental illness that we're going to be able to treat within a psychiatric hospital. Somebody who's very suicidal or who's hearing voices telling them, they have to commit acts of violence or the world will end, those folks might need more mental health treatment. And that's where 5150 can come into play. So it's an involuntary psychiatric hold for dangerousness to self or someone else. And you can also get one for grave disability, which is when somebody's not able to provide for their own food, clothing, or shelter. It's a pathway to get that person into inpatient hospitalization, to inpatient mental health care. But that often can be a way to get them out of their house and not have them not have access to a firearm while they're in the hospital. As many of you know, the Second Amendment protects our rights to own firearms, but it's not without restrictions. And many of those restrictions are actually aimed at folks who are part of the mental health system. So I want to talk really specifically about at what point in the mental health system you might have your Second Amendment rights suspended and what kind of mental health services you can get that shouldn't affect your firearm rights. There are some federal and state laws that prohibit firearm ownership and purchase for mental health related events. So the Gun Control Act of 1968 is a piece of federal legislation that regulates the firearm industry and owners. And there are also state and other federal regulations that target specific mental health related events. The Gun Control Act has a list of prohibited persons that it says these people can't own firearms. And many of these may look familiar to you: felons, people who are addicted to controlled substances, people who have been respondents to domestic violence restraining orders, and anyone who is adjudicated as a mental defective. That generally means folks who have been found incompetent to stand trial or not guilty by reason of insanity. For our purposes, committed to a mental institution is maybe the most important one, because this has to do with being on a 5150 and being psychiatrically hospitalized, but it happens further down the road. So it's not just being put on a hold. It happens after you've been admitted to a psychiatric hospital and you've had a hearing before a judge or a hearing officer in that hospital. And it's only when the judge or hearing officer certifies your 5150 hold or one of the other holds that you become committed to a mental institution and no longer able to own or purchase a firearm. California has a few state-level mental health prohibitions. So if you're admitted to a psychiatric hospital, even if you never get to the court hearing, if you're admitted to a psychiatric hospital because you were dangerous to yourself or someone else, you are prohibited from owning or purchasing a firearm in the state for 5 years. Also, if you've been court-ordered to outpatient psychiatric treatment or you've been court-ordered onto a conservatorship, you're prohibited for the duration of that order. What's not a state-level or a federal-level prohibition is seeking outpatient mental health care, going to a therapist, asking your primary care doctor for antidepressants, seeing a psychiatrist for your anxiety. Those things are not prohibitory events, and I know there's a lot of concern that seeking mental health care may cause you to lose your firearm rights. But outpatient mental health care is an important part of mental health and mental well-being, and it doesn't have an effect on your rights. It's really important to know this because you could one day be that person in crisis. It's important to look out for your family and friends in your community, but it's also really important to look out for yourself. One thing you can do to maintain your independence should that situation ever happen is have a plan in place just in case it does arise. Involve somebody that you trust that you can talk to about these things. And designate a strategy that if you get into a place of crisis, they will help you make your firearms inaccessible. That may involve storing them off-site or changing the combinations to your safe for you or helping you disassemble them and take out pieces. It's also important for you to know what mental health and crisis resources are available, not just so you can help your friends and family, but in case you need to help yourself as well. These are temporary measures until you've recovered, because remember, most mental health crises do come and go. They ebb and flow, and they're time limited. But it's important, again, to keep that time and space between you and anything lethal during that time. There are also things you can do for your mental health preventatively. You can stay active. So exercise is a great way to boost your mood and your self-esteem. Stay positive. Think about how to avoid negativity in your life and focus on the things that bring you pleasure and joy, like connecting with other people, which is something that oftentimes when we have problems with depression, we start to fall off from doing, but it's a really important part of keeping our mood up. Getting enough sleep is also a good mood booster, and something that is harder and harder to do the more stress and anxiety you have in your life becomes even more important. You can create positive coping skills, so learning new ways to deal with stressors and emotional obstacles that are bound to come up in your life. Making sure you're enjoying your hobbies and the things that get you out of bed in the morning and bring you joy. And maybe most importantly, and also one of the most difficult, is seeking care when you need it and feeling comfortable going to talk to a professional about your mental health when things get to a point where you can't handle it on your own anymore. So let's talk a little bit about where resources are available, and this information will be available on our website as well, and you'll get a link to that at the end of this talk. But there is free, confidential, 24/7 crisis support available at the 988 hotline. There's also a special 988 hotline subsection for veterans if you call 988 and then press 1. And then there's also the National Domestic Violence Hotline for anybody experiencing an abusive relationship. If you're just interested in learning more about mental health, and particularly about mental health and firearms, Walk the Talk America is a great Pro-2A nonprofit that bridges the gap between mental health and responsible firearm ownership. They have a lot of great information and resources. And the National Sports Shooting Foundation has partnered with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention on a project called Brave Conversations that's talking about mental health and suicide prevention for firearm owners. Also, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, has a lot of great resources that are very educational about different mental illnesses, mental health resources, medications, things like that. If you need help finding mental health services or other supportive services, you can go to Mental Health America and find help for yourself or someone else. There's also a therapist locator on Psychology Today that will search by geographic area. And if you call 211, you can get local health and social services, including things like employment support, substance use support, counseling, housing, and shelter. If you want more information on protective orders, one of the best places to go is selfhelp.courts.ca.gov. They have a whole outline that will help you get a better sense of what protective order might apply to the situation you're concerned about, and it walks through the various types that I mentioned. And this is a link to our website where you can find all of the information that we just covered in terms of resources and more information about the intersection between firearms and mental health and other helpful resources. That concludes my presentation, but please continue watching to learn more about this topic. Today you'll learn ways from your instructor that you can protect yourself and others with a firearm. But we're also going to talk about a different kind of protection and safety. How to help keep people safe when they're in a crisis. I'm going to talk through some hypothetical examples of when a firearm in the context of a mental health crisis could be deadly, and the importance of temporarily putting some time and space between the person at risk and their gun. These exact scenarios may not apply to you, but there will probably be elements that you recognize from your own life. Jacob's a 15-year-old boy in your Boy Scout troop. He's normally engaged and social, and he has a lot of friends in the troop. He's a cross-country runner and a good student at school, and he's emerged as a leader on the overnight outdoor trips. He's one of your troop's best marksmen, and he earned his rifle shooting merit badge last spring. Both of his parents work in law enforcement, and they're your neighbors. You know his family well, and you often have them over for backyard barbecues in the summer. In the last few weeks after breaking up with a girl at school, Jacob's attendance at scout meetings really dropped off. He briefly joined your families for dinner last week, but he seemed withdrawn and irritable, and he went home early. You asked his parents how he was doing, and they indicated that they were worried about him. But his dad shrugged it off, saying, "Teenagers, what can you do?" Then you ran into Jacob at school pickup yesterday and asked how he was. And it struck you as strange that he didn't want to talk or even make eye contact with you. When you asked him if he was coming to the next scout meeting, he said, "Why bother? None of that matters anymore." He mumbled an excuse and walked away. Take a minute to consider these questions. Is this person in a mental health crisis? Do you think that access to a firearm could make this situation more dangerous? What might be options for helping them get the support that they need? What could you do to reduce their access to lethal means like firearms? Jacob's exhibiting a lot of the signs of adolescent depression. Oftentimes, teenagers manifest this by being more irritable and withdrawn, rather than classically sad or depressed. But maybe what's most concerning is how drastic of a change this is from Jacob's usual self. That's how you really know something's wrong. We don't know if he's having thoughts about suicide now, but it can be hard to tell what goes on in the mind of a teenager, especially one who isn't being particularly communicative. Adolescent emotions can fluctuate rapidly and be felt very intensely. And teenagers' frontal lobes, the part of their brain responsible for long-term planning and good decision-making, isn't well developed yet. They're at high risk of acting without thinking, especially when they have intense negative feelings. Jacob's parents have firearms at home, and he's obviously comfortable handling guns from his experience with the Boy Scout troop. You might be worried that he could impulsively grab one if his emotions became too overwhelming in the moment. As his troop leader and his steward of safety, this might be a good time for you to talk to his parents about making sure all of their weapons are securely stored in a way that Jacob can't access them. This might mean changing the combination on the gun safe, making sure he doesn't know where the keys to the lockbox are, or even removing all the firearms from the home temporarily and storing them with a trusted friend or family member. They may also want to do the same with any medications that are particularly lethal in overdose, like cardiac or psychiatric meds, as well as Tylenol. Your father-in-law, Richard, moved in with you about a year ago after his wife passed away and his memory started getting worse. In the last few months, you've noticed he's been misplacing things more, starting a story and then losing track of what he's talking about. Mostly he's able to take care of himself with some supervision, but then the other day he mistook you for his brother who's been dead for over 30 years. And twice he started a conversation with his daughter as though she was his wife and it was 1996. Richard's also become fixated on the people who live across the street, accusing them of breaking into the house and taking his things. Even though all of his missing items are eventually found misplaced somewhere inside the house, he's convinced they continue to come in unseen and rob him. And he gets increasingly angry when he talks about it. The other day, you found a kitchen knife that he'd stashed under the cushions of the armchair, and when you confronted him with the knife, he said he was just afraid of what those people might do the next time they came over, and he's willing to do what it takes to keep you all safe. Take a minute to consider these questions. Is this person in a mental health crisis? Do you think that access to a firearm could make this situation more dangerous? What might be options for helping them get the support that they need? What could you do to reduce their access to lethal means like firearms? Unfortunately, Richard's exhibiting a lot of the symptoms of progressive cognitive decline, or dementia. It sounds like the memory loss has been getting worse over the course of the last few months, but now he's also misperceiving who he's with and where he is. He's also paranoid and delusional about the neighbors. Taken all together, these things make him high risk for hurting somebody. Even a person with little tendency towards violence might go to extremes if they believe they were protecting their family from harm. Depending on what kind of guns are in the home, who uses them, and what they're for, you may want to consider various options to make sure Richard can't get a hold of one. This could include making sure all the weapons in the home are securely stored in a way that Richard can't access them. This may mean changing the combo on the gun safe, making sure he doesn't know where the keys to the lockbox are, or even removing all the firearms from the home temporarily and storing them with a trusted friend or family member. It can be really hard to have these conversations with someone like Richard because nobody likes to lose their independence. But he's getting to a place where he probably shouldn't be driving, cooking, or accessing firearms unsupervised. And your role is to help keep him and everyone around him as safe as possible. A good friend from college, Brad, is in the middle of a messy divorce after 10 years of marriage. He and his wife have been fighting over custody of the 2 children and over their finances. And several times he said, "This is going to be the end of me." You know that his construction company wasn't doing well before they decided to split, and now he spent tens and thousands of dollars on attorney's fees for the divorce. He recently found out that the bank was starting foreclosure proceedings on his house. Brad's a good guy and normally very even-keeled, but all this stress is putting him over the edge. Twice this month, he's bailed on you and another buddy for a planned hunting trip, and he didn't even give any reason. When you do hang out with him, he doesn't seem that motivated to do much or even really talk. He's been drinking a lot more too, which makes him angry and morose. When you and another buddy finally dragged him out to a bar 2 nights ago, he picked a fight with some guy that he said cut him in line. Brad yelled at him, and then even after the guy apologized, Brad shoved him into a wall, which got Brad thrown out of the bar. He went outside to check on him and to offer him a ride home, but he said, "Screw it, you all would be better off if I was dead anyway. Goodbye." And he stormed out into the road. Take a minute to consider these questions. Is this person in a mental health crisis? Do you think that access to a firearm could make this situation more dangerous? What might be options for helping them get the support that they need? What could you do to reduce their access to lethal means like firearms? Relationship losses like divorce can be really stressful times for people, especially when it threatens to upend their family and their relationship with their children. Financial problems are another big life stressor, and Brad has all of these things going on at once. The pressure is really building for him, and he's starting to exhibit behaviors that are out of the norm for Brad, ranging from isolating from friends to picking fights in bars. As his buddy, you'd be right to be worried and to want to help. His comments about the divorce being the end of him and about people being better off if he was dead might make you wonder if he's thinking about ending his life. And when you add in his heavy drinking and access to firearms into the mix, it could be a deadly combo. One of the ways you can help Brad is by putting some time and space between him and his firearms for a bit. There may not be much you can do about his marriage, his business, or his house, but you can help get him through this hard time by making sure he doesn't make a bad decision that might be a permanent one. Samantha's one of your coworkers, and you're glad that she finally got out of the relationship she's been in. She's had a long-time live-in boyfriend that nobody really likes. He shoots at the same range as you, and he's almost always there when you go, but he never says hello. In the past few months when she's talked about him, it sounded like he's become more controlling and angry, stealing her phone to read her texts, following her, and accusing her of lying about what she's doing. You're not sure why she finally decided to break up with him, but she texted you on a Friday evening last week and asked if you could be at her house early the next morning with your truck to help her move. She's really apologetic about the late notice, and it seemed like an emergency. You showed up and helped load up her stuff to bring to her sister's. And right as you were finishing, her boyfriend came out of the house and confronted you. He got right in your face and accused you of poisoning her mind and spreading falsehoods about him, and he blamed you for their breakup. Then he started going on in a loud voice about how he was going to show you what kind of man he really was and how he wasn't going to let this slide because people like the two of you deserved everything coming their way. 2 nights ago, you were leaving work late and you noticed one other car in the lot, parked far away from the entrance with the engine still running. When you drove past, you could see it was him, staring intently at the second floor where you and Samantha work and muttering to himself. Yesterday, he sent both you and Samantha an obscenity-laced text saying you had both better watch your backs because he has you in his crosshairs. Samantha's really worried and reveals that he has been violent before. Take a minute to consider these questions. Is this person in a mental health crisis? Do you think that access to a firearm could make this situation more dangerous? What might be options for helping them get the support that they need? What could you do to reduce their access to lethal means like firearms? Most people would find the ex-boyfriend's behavior concerning in this scenario. He's got a lot of red flags, including a past history of violence, jealous and controlling behavior, and some paranoid ideas about you. He's also having a lot of trouble controlling his anger to the point where he's crossed multiple lines lately. Maybe he's just an odd, introverted guy blowing off steam after a breakup, but it's pretty worrisome that he's continuing to target you and Samantha 2 weeks later, and that you saw him checking out your workplace after hours. Workplace violence, like mass shootings, is rare, but it often starts as an incident of domestic or intimate partner violence that spills out into more public places. Regardless, this is somebody whose behavior has reached the level of stalking and harassing, if not outright threatening. And you'd be right to be concerned about your and Samantha's safety, as well as that of your coworkers. In these situations, various protective orders can prohibit him from contacting certain people, visiting certain places, and having access to firearms. Depending on the specifics of the situation, this might be an appropriate time for a domestic violence restraining order, a workplace protective order, or a gun violence restraining order to make sure he doesn't have access to lethal means until he cools down. All of these scenarios were about other people you might interact with in your life. But remember that you could be the person in crisis too. Think about making a plan for your own firearms should that happen. And know what mental health and other resources are available to you and others in your community, and how to access them. Keeping yourself and your family safe means more than protecting them from accident or attack. To be a steward of safety for your community, you have to take care of yourself and your mental health. I hope you all learned something today about this important topic, and thanks for being here.